We got a lot to cover, guys. Today we are going to be summarizing the Ickabog chapters 21 to 30. Also, like I always say, I am looking to the side because I have a couple pages of notes and I'm using a new system for that, so I will make a video on that in the future. Honestly, I don't feel too motivated to make these videos. I've been keeping with the Ickabog, sorta. I'm on like chapter 40 or so. They're at chapter like 67 now. And also, if you didn't already watch my other videos, I'll have the link in the description down below for those, the other Ickabog summaries. But yeah, let's just get started. So we're going to be starting with chapter 21. The next morning after the funeral, Lord Fulpoon brings in his professor named Professor Shaw, who is an old man who believes in the Ickabog as well. Then goes on to say that few people believe in the Ickabog. He has formed a habit of keeping the knowledge to himself. This professor, however, was just like Nobby Buttons, for it was Spittleworth's butler, who was named Otto Scrumble. Otto would do anything for gold and agreed to impersonate the professor for 100 ducats. The fake professor then goes on to describe the Ickabog, but the king interrupts him when he tries to describe it. For example, when the professor says,
"It's as tall as 2 horses."
Then the king interrupts him by saying,
"If not taller."
And then goes on and on like that, so the king keeps interrupting him. I've decided to move my camera angle a little bit. It doesn't look like I'm looking to the side too much. So then Fraud Sham says he believed the Ickabog learned to speak human by taking people prisoner before disemboweling them and eating its victims. He believes that he forces them to give them English lessons. He states, moreover, the Ickabog has a very long and vengeful memory. If outwitted by a victim, as you outwit it, sire, by escaping its deadly clutches, it has sometimes sneaked out of the marsh under cover of darkness, and claimed its victim while he or she slept. Now the king, Spittleworth, and Fulpoon, and the professor tried to devise a plan. There will be men that patrol the edge of the marshlands to ensure that the Ickabog can't leave. And then they want to protect King Fred, just in case the Ickabog decides to hunt them down. They will need a lot of armor and equipment, so they ask every household in Cornucopia to pay 2 gold ducats per month. That's the end of chapter 21, now into chapter 22. Chapter 22. So now the monthly tax of the 2 golden ducats is imposed on every house in Cornucopia to protect the country from the Ickabog. The tax collectors would have staring white eyes like lamps painted on the back of their black uniforms. This was to remind the people of what the tax was for. Once they collected enough gold, Spittleworth decided to raise a statue in memory of the Ickabog's victim. Spittleworth and the public decided to make a statue of Nobby Buttons and put it in the middle of the largest public square in Chokesville. Now Spittleworth insisted that they make a portrait of the king fighting the Ickabog, and the king agreed. Now some people had some questions about what happened recently. Some murmured along themselves that Spittleworth shouldn't be allowed to take over as chief advisor without a proper vote. There was a reward for 10 ducats if he reported someone for saying the Ickabog wasn't real. Also, many people now would put off cheap wooden signs on their doors and would say, "Proud to pay the Ickabog tax," or "Down with the Ickabog, up with the king." So they're supporting this movement and because they don't want to be put to jail. The Beamish house was decorated with many Ickabog banners, while Daisy's wasn't. Spittleworth noticed the absence of flags and signs on the Dovetail's cottage, and he kept the information in mind because one day it would become useful. Chapter 23. Now Spittleworth had to think of ways to get rid of the 3 soldiers locked up in the dungeons. His latest idea was to feed them poison in their soup and pretend they died of natural causes. The people were questioning the soldiers and their punishment. Some said,
"We want to know when our boys are going to stand trial. We've locked them up for months now."
Spittleworth disregarded what they said and just said,
"Your men will be put on trial tomorrow, and it will take place in the largest square in Chokesville."
Spittleworth tells the 3 soldiers that they will be on trial tomorrow morning, but they question it and refuse to tell nothing but the truth. But like Spittleworth always does, but he threatened them to tell the lies he already told on the kingdom. The soldiers told the lies that Spittleworth said, but all they got in return was throwing cabbages at them by the people. Chapter 24. Daisy was about to turn 8 years old and she decided to invite Bert Beamish for tea. Daisy sent an invitation for this and Bert accepted. Mr. Dovetail bought the last bottle of Drobum wine and Daisy used all her savings to buy 2 expensive Hopes of Heaven for herself and Bert. The tea didn't start out as well as they thought they would, as Mr. Dovetail was proposed a toast to Mayor Beamish, which made Mrs. Beamish cry. Until Bert brought out a bandolier, which is sort of like a yo-yo at the time. But Daisy had never seen one of these before and Bert did teach her how to use it, and she swiftly became better at that than Bert was. Bert had missed Daisy since they last talked, but now they were enjoying themselves and put the subject of dead parents, the fights, King Fred in their past. Now on the other hand, Mr. Dovetail and Mrs. Beamish got into a little argument over if Nobby Buttons was real or not and if Mayor Beamish really got killed from the Ickabog. Mr. Dovetail is mad that there isn't any evidence showing the death of Mr. Beamish and how Nobby Button's coffin was so heavy. They argue very loudly, get into an argument that requires screaming, and soon enough, Mrs. Beamish tells Bert and her to go home. Bert, however, didn't mean to push the Hopes of Heaven hard, but with it in Daisy's hands, she lost her grip on the box and the pastries fell to the ground. Daisy was in tears and Bert and his mother left the Dovetail's house. Chapter 25. Now because of the taxes, Cornucopia was slowly growing poorer. Spittleworth previously had sent out spies to the villages to hear a word of what people were saying. One spy arrived at the palace at midnight, and Spittleworth immediately got Lord Flappoon and Mayor Roach to come inside. The spy found that the houses that were against this Ickabog tax, and including a person named Tubby Tenderloin. Roach says that they should have arrested for treason and slung in jail. Spittleworth says that there are 200 people who are in this, and they don't have room for 200 people. Then suddenly a footman, Cankerby, comes into the room to inform the lords that there is somebody else in the city within a city who thinks the same way as the traitors. Cankerby says that this man is Dan Dovetail. The footman heard about this because he overheard Mrs. Beamish tell a maid about what he said after the tea party. Spittleworth then rewards him with 10 ducats. And the last question Spittleworth asks is, what does Mr. Dovetail do? And he replies back by saying that he's a carpenter. Now Spittleworth now had the idea that hit him that was so amazing that he had to clutch the back of the sofa because he felt like he might topple over. Chapter 26. The next day, Mayor Roach knocked on Mr. Dovetail's door and said that it was an urgent job for him to come to the palace and a shaft on the king's carriage has broken and he needs it tomorrow. Mr. Dovetail said of course and followed Roach back to the castle. When Mr. Dovetail made it to the castle and walked past the guards, one soldier had thrown a flour sack on Mr. Dovetail's head and 2 more pinned on his arm behind his back, tied his wrists together with the rope, and Mr. Dovetail struggled but Mr. Roach muttered in his ear, "Make one sound and it'll be your daughter who pays the price." So Mr. Dovetail stayed shut. Then now they looked into the dungeon and they locked him up for Spittleworth to see him. When Spittleworth talks to Mr. Dovetail, he said that he wants to carve a gigantic foot, a monstrous foot with razor claws. On top of it, there should be a long handle so that a man on a horseback can press the foot into the solid ground, make an imprint. Mr. Dovetail agrees, and this is the only way he can see Daisy as soon as possible, and he is only left with an enormous piece of wood, his chisels, and his knives. Chapter 27. When Daisy got back to school, she found that all the furniture was gone, as there were pictures on the walls, the rug on the floor, the lamps, and even the stove. As soon as Daisy opened her mouth to call for her father, a sack was thrown over her head and a hand clamped over her mouth. A rough
voice in her ear said, "If you make one noise, I will kill your father."
She was put into a wagon and heard the jingling of the harness, trotting hooves as they began to move. Daisy was taken outside the city within the city, and the man who kidnapped Daisy was a large, rough member of the Ickabog Defense Brigade called Private Prod. Spittleworth previously had told Prod to get rid of this little Dovetail girl, which meant that he had to kill her. Prod also had a niece around Daisy's age, of whom he was very fond of, and he'd imagined himself strangling Daisy, but his niece would come up in his mind pleading for his life. So Prod kept on debating what he should do with Daisy. Prod didn't want to kill Daisy, so he remembered that there was an old woman who lived on the outskirts of Drobum, which was his hometown. Everyone called this woman Ma Grunter, and she took in orphans, and no boy or girl had ever succeeded in running away. This is what Prod decided to take Daisy to, and the last thing he wanted was for Daisy to find her way back to Chokesville because Spittleworth would likely to be furious with him, and Prod hadn't done what he was told. When they reached Ma Grunter's house, Prod handed over Daisy and paid her a 5 ducat placement fee without another word. Chapter 28. Daisy was now in Ma Grunter's house, and she learned that she was very harsh and she calls all her girls Jane and all her boys John. Daisy didn't like being called Jane, so she said, "My name is Daisy Dovetail. I was named after my mother's favorite flower." And Ma Grunter said,
"Your mother is dead and your father is dead."
She agreed that her mother is dead, but not her father. Ma Grunter didn't approve of the disrespect that Daisy was giving her, so Ma Grunter swung her cane at Daisy. She ducked, but it came back hitting her painfully in the ear, knocking her sideways. Ma Grunter now said,
"Repeat after me. My father is dead and my name is Jane."
Daisy still said, "I won't." Before the cane could swing back at her, she darted under Ma Grunter's arms and ran off into the house, hoping that she could escape through the back door. Then Daisy ran upstairs and into the attic for Ma Grunter not to get her. Ma Grunter left off one of her boys, called Basher John, to guard the attic so she couldn't get out. Every hour, Ma Grunter banged on the hatch with her cane and said,
"What's your name?"
And Daisy always replied with Daisy Dovetail. Finally, Daisy was becoming very thirsty, and she finally gave in and replied to Ma Grunter with an answer that she wanted. Ma Grunter smacked her on the ear and told Daisy to go eat a small bowl of cabbage soup, which was the nastiest thing she ever ate. Daisy then went on to meet the other girls, and she found herself looking into the kind blue eyes of a girl her own age, and she wanted to know her real name. She told Daisy that they weren't allowed to say their actual name. Daisy insisted, and she said that her name was Martha. Chapter 29. Back in Chokesville, Spittleworth made sure to tell the townspeople that the Dovetail family had packed up in the middle of the night and moved into the neighboring country of Pluteria. Bert, on the other hand, was very devastated and remembered all the times that Daisy and him had together. Mrs. Beamish had even regretted telling the maid about what Mr. Dovetail had said about the Ickabog not being real. That evening, Mrs. Beamish and Bert took a stroll on the same cottage and laid between the city within the city where the Dovetails used to live. Mrs. Beamish opened the door to find that there was no furniture there, and it was as if the Dovetails had packed up and gone to Pluteria. As she was walking back to her cottage, she noticed some girls jump roping, and one of them was wearing a beautiful little dress that had daisies embroidered neck and cuffs, and that was the one exactly that Daisy used to wear. Chapter 3. The month passed and Mr. Dovetail was still working on the wooden foot, and in his head he kept saying,
They'll never let you go after this, never.
he drove out the fear and he would sing the national anthem. He was doing this so he could show himself faithful to the king and less danger of himself when they released him. When the last wooden foot was finished, Spittleworth, Falpoon, and Mayor Roach came down to the dungeons to inspect it. They all agreed that the wooden foot looks good, but they don't release Mr. Dovetail, but instead they say,
I'll tell the Wanderer to give you an extra rations tonight.
that is the end of chapters 21 through 30. Summarizing it, hope you got value out of this video. This is sort of longer, sorry I talked a little bit fast, but I'll be trying to pump out more of these in the future, maybe because I know that is what you guys like to see. But yeah, that is all I had for this Ickabog summary. If you didn't already, be sure to check out my other videos in the link in the description down below. I will also have my notes, so you can refer to that after this video because that's all the notes that I took. But yeah, that's all I had for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.